So I'd like to introduce our next panel who are waiting here. Our moderator is Adrian Miller, General Manager, NZ for Infrastructure Sustainability Council. Our panellists are Sean Ordain, Strategic Planning Manager for Wellington Council, Michaela Lander, Technical Director, Social Planning from GHD, and Matt Ensor, Founder and CEO of Frankly AI. I'll say that again, Founder and CEO of Frankly AI. Don't forget to submit your questions via the app. Meanwhile, for our technology and transformation discussion, a big round of applause, please, for our panel.
So thank you everybody for joining us for this session on technology and transformation and the role of infrastructure in delivering inclusive access to both opportunity and resilience. As we all know, infrastructure is there to serve people and communities, and we need to ensure that their needs are met. At the same time, as we've heard at some length through this morning's sessions, the sector's faced with the need to deliver resilient assets, and delivering those assets in a way which is carbon friendly and does no harm to the environment, ideally does some good. We've already heard about the value of thinking globally and acting locally. In this session, we look at the integral role of people in informing and shaping our urban form, and the role of tech in supporting that delivery. And we've already heard a little bit on these themes in the earlier discussions. The objective is long-term assets that will meet changing demographic needs while generating net zero, resilience and inclusivity outcomes through the whole life cycle of the asset, from planning, design, delivery, to operations and beyond. And we've got a great panel pulled together here today to examine these issues. First, we've got Matt Ensor, as Mariama said, founder of Frankly AI, a stakeholder tool, amplifying voices and opinions in an unfiltered way. And then we have Sean Ordain, Strategic Planning Manager at Wellington City, who has also been heavily involved with the Wellington technology journey and digital twin in Wellington, and may also be willing to tell us a little bit about Wellington City's new district plan, which I believe has a local perspective on the resilience issue and the impact of some of the law reform that we've heard about this morning, particularly how we address sea level rise and potential coastal retreat. And last but not least, we have Michaela Lander of GHD, who's founder of Lovable. We sometimes talk about green strings, but here today, Michaela's going to talk to us about heartstrings, how we relate to our communities and how that in turn affects the built environment and our perceptions of it. So I'm going to start first off and give each of the panellists a chance to talk a little bit about their area of interest and passion. So I think we'll start with you, Matt. Can you tell us a little bit about Frankly AI, why you developed it, what were the problems that you were trying to surmount, and how you think it will help us ensure what we design really does meet people's needs?
Sure, kia ora koutou. Thank you for the invitation, Adrian, to come along. This is quite the panel. My fascination is that sort of intersection of infrastructure, community and technology. So when people say to me, "Oh, Matt, you're an engineer, aren't you?" I sort of go, "Oh, yeah." So I was one of those weirdos who did engineering and social science back at university, which you'd think they were kind of incompatible. And to be fair, it's taken about 20 years for us to go on a journey as a country to get to that point where I actually start to think infrastructure, community and technology is now starting to sort of wind together. I was involved in transportation. My enthusiasm I've described, my frustration forever was public consultation. And so we'd hear from the same people saying very predictable things. They were highly educated, a lot of time on their hands, or they're really angry. And what I thought was, oh, this is terrible, because what we're doing is we're just building their feedback into our projects and sort of keeping the status quo going. What I found actually wasn't quite true. It was basically they were ignoring the feedback because they kind of knew what it would be. Worse off, there were whole parts of the community that weren't being heard. So in all my studies, I never heard the word community equity. I can't remember that word arising until about 2 years ago, I'd say. Maybe I'm a bit of a sheltered soul. But the whole idea with community equity actually has its origins back in Roman times. So this is that public organisations, government, and frankly anyone who's funded by public money, there's an obligation on you to know exactly what your stakeholders need. And we have a terrible tradition of kind of working out what the average stakeholder is, and then kind of adding on stuff for cultural reasons, bit of disability, infrastructure, and those sort of things. And so what, frankly, AI does is we designed it, I invented it to try and break through those barriers. We did a little bit of an experiment. I don't know how many of you are like me, are Aucklanders, but all credit to Auckland Council and Auckland Transport, probably 2 years ago, I can't remember, COVID, did this amazing job consulting Aucklanders on the future of transport. And I think we had a record number of respondees, about 1.2% of Aucklanders. And so we had this conversation, and did the other 98% not care? And so we did a little bit of survey, and we found actually pretty much every Aucklander has a strong view on how we should be spending our money on transport. So the challenge was, how do you engage people with these strong views? We found a few things. We found people have survey fatigue. They don't want to fill out another jolly online form that they might not ever get read. They're sick of filling out scripted surveys where they kind of know you've made your mind up what it's going to be. Some of them are like, man, I've just got no time. I just want to text you, la-di-da-di-da, love Matt. I don't want to go through your form. Why can't you do that? My kids communicate like that. And we had other people who said, I just want to say what I want to say. Just listen to me. And finally, we were talking to some of the communities around Auckland and discovered that language and culture is a big barrier for people to engage. And it wasn't what I thought. I was talking to people they were talking to me in English. Their English was fine. But to cut a long story short, a lot of the way that we a lot of the way we consult is very transactional. It's very Western. It's like, tell me what you think. It's not respectful. It doesn't take time to get to know someone. In fact, when we talked to Māori in Pacifica, they were saying, no, it just doesn't work. So one of the breakthroughs we've made with Frankly is actually creating a conversational agent that was trained actually by Priscilla Steele, who now works for the GHD next to me. It was trained to be really, really engaging. You know, someone who's constantly asking questions. Hey, that's fascinating. Tell me more about that. So that's Frankly. Frankly speaks many languages. And the breakthrough for us was being able to do authentic Te Reo Māori. My personal view is all government organisations should be bilingual in their communication. And it shouldn't be a translation, it should be a communication. And so that we couldn't do that. And in fact, no one else in the world has been able to do that. So we're kind of sitting at this very, very exciting moment. I want to show you, just before I finish, a couple of images and an animation. I don't know if we can bring the screen up. If we go to the next one, you've probably seen this if you've been to any of my presentations. I love this. This is kind of equity 101. I say to people, equity is not democracy. You don't provide for the most common and then try and work out the rest. If you look at the top there, don't we do this all the time? In fact, someone said to me, Matt, we should roll out e-bikes to everyone. And actually, that's not a bad idea, frankly. But have a look at the top one there. So we rolled out the same solution. This is kind of how we traditionally have done infrastructure. We're kind of like, well, this is probably going to work, you know. Use it and benefit. And what you see there is 3/4 of cyclists find cycling unpleasant. Equity is about finding out at an individual level and providing at that individual level. And we've never been able to do that before because we haven't had the technology to go to speak to tens of thousands of people and ask them specifically what their aspirations are. We heard a little bit about storytelling before. So storytelling's fine, but you've got to listen to people's stories. Don't get them to fill out I strongly agree, I strongly disagree. Who knows why they strongly disagree? Actually ask them for their stories. If we go to the next slide, whenever you're talking about AI, it always comes back to privacy or ethics. So I just grabbed this. This is public information, so there's nothing in there. This is test information. This is my own team typing stuff in. And there's not much information in there. Some of ours have thousands of entries. But what you can see is you can actually find out I can't read that myself. I think this is on housing. You know, what's people's views on housing? And actually go through the folk who responded in Te Reo Māori or ethnicity or those sort of things and get down to actually what they're saying. And what the AI does, of course, is aggregate. It gives you the themes. and those sorts of things. So yeah, we're really exciting. We're a new startup, fully owned and funded by Becca, thank you. And I want to show you, to finish off, just an animation. I don't know if you heard about Lambda, the sentient AI. So what we've got here is GPT-3 on the right, talking to Frankly. This is how we test Frankly. We actually hook up the two AIs and say, hey, have a good old chat. And this is kind of weird. OpenAI is, this is GPT-3, so it actually makes up stuff. And so I can't actually read that. It says, Frankly says, what would you like me to call you? GPT-3 says, Sarah, which is weird, isn't it? A little bit sentient. It gets quicker what it's doing. They're actually kind of handshaking or doing weird things in the background that AI does. Where do you live, Sarah? Seattle, Washington. So what do you think's great about Seattle? So what's Frankly's trying to do? Very open question. And GPT-3 comes out with something really vague. So Frankly's like, oh, I really need to know more. Is it really good for your community? GPT-3 comes back with something really vague. And so you can see Frankly's constantly trying to expand out until it finds something that GPT-3, in this case, really wants to talk about. And I think it's public transport. No, we're not quite there yet. Sorry, I'm giving it away. Sorry, Sarah. Oh, it's just talking about, this is amazing. The AI is making up. It's Sarah, who's Caucasian, and I think she's 32 or something. Every time you run this, it makes up another character. But this isn't the point. You wait till it starts talking about something specific. 33 years old. What do you think could benefit from improvements in Seattle? So now it's talking about public transport. So Frankly loves this because it's got lots of questions about public transport. So I think we'll end it there. So Frankly, what we're trying to do is not replace how we consult on infrastructure. What we're trying to do is break down all those barriers so different parts of the community that just don't engage with what we're doing actually feel like they have a voice. But not only that, we can kind of see exactly what they think and try and provide those bicycles that are tailored for people so everyone gets the same benefit, not the same service. So thank you. I could go on for a while.
Great. That's great, Matt.
Pleasure.
Thank you. No voice left behind in Susan Freeman Green's
Yeah,
apology this
that's our
morning.
mission. Yeah, no voice left behind.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to move now to Sean. Sean, can you tell us a little bit about the phenomena of digital twin and how that's played out for Wellington City, and how you see digital twin helping us with both resilience and livability into the future? We'll stick with livability for now, Michaela, until we've got to you. So livability for the future for your city's inhabitants.
Excellent. So my name's Sean. I'm from Wellington. I'm all right. I'm from the government. I'm here to help. So I'm a town planner, a very unusual one because I spend a lot of my time with computers. And to me, cities are wonderful things because they are the patterns of people's lives made flesh. So have you ever stood in Queen Street and wondered why there's a bend in the middle of it? It's because it's a tributary of a stream that used to come down there and people used to walk around it, and eventually when the buildings got built, it left a kink in the street. But these patterns appear everywhere. They tell us so much about life and about not just what people think, but what people do. And that's where this idea of digital twins comes from. So you would have all seen maps, you would have seen three-dimensional models of cities. A twin is the fusion of that model into reality. And so you get effectively a digital dimension to everything around you. A really simple example is when the earth shakes in Wellington, there are sensors beneath all of the intersections. They feed data back through the streetlights to our central hubs. They tell us how the ground has moved. That allows us to then access sensors inside the buildings and understand how the buildings have moved. That all gets distributed to building inspectors. They inspect the buildings. Things are made safe. We, in parallel, can tell how many dogs are registered to those buildings, how many businesses, and every part of the bureaucracy that runs the city can go from working in chains to working in parallel. What this means is, during the Seddon earthquake, it took my teams 3 days to inspect the city. During the Kaikoura earthquake, it took a day and a half. Now it takes 1 day. Central Wellington is the country's single most intensely productive economic environment. Our CBD produces the same amount of GDP as Central Auckland, including Parnell, Ponsonby and Newmarket. every day we keep that CBD running, we save about 8% of GDP. That's the power of digital. And that's why this idea of digital twin is so important. We've entered the century of climate impact. Climate change isn't a problem for our children, it's a problem for us. We received a world that was imperfect, and we will hand on one that is still imperfect. But that doesn't mean it has to be totally that way. And so what my teams have been doing is working to bring this knowledge into a transparent, democratic environment that we can sustain chains of decisions over very long times, bringing together science and the different gifts of our communities and our staff to support our politicians to make those decisions. That's the problem with climate change. It's not going to be a single decision that saves the world. It is going to be hundreds of thousands of mundane choices, from what you eat, to what you build, to where it gets built, to what happens in the event of a change of government or an election. That's what will change the destiny of the city. And so that's what we're building for. So what that means is there's the digital twins that you'll probably be most familiar with, which are the ones we use to show how the sea level rises and show, for example, the distortion between the uplift occurring during earthquakes and the subsidence occurring between them versus the sea rising. But there's also the digital twins we use to understand the embodied carbon. So the City Council is one of the largest carbon traders in the country. We have been for many, many years. And that's because we can measure the embodied carbon on our lands. But we can also join it to the other things that are that complex mesh that forms a city. So for example, many of you will have heard of Zealandia. We've reversed the extinction of 9 bird species in the city. It's amazing that the most common places to see a kaka now are in the remote bush and just off the main street in the capital city. And because we could join these together, we could start to create environments that were more livable, where those patterns of life enhance life. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. A digital twin isn't an idea that is designed to control, it's an idea that's designed to understand. And it's only through understanding cities and learning together that we can create the dignity and the reform that our democracy needs to ultimately succeed.
Great, fantastic answers. I've got a few more questions for you, Sean, but we'll wait for those. So, Makala, perhaps turning to you, it's going to be a really open question, which is just tell us about Lovable and the concept and what you think it brings to the discourse about livability, urban form, and how responsive it is to the communities that infrastructure is designed to serve.
Yeah, that's a very open question. Well, I will start and say tēnā koutou. Ko wangi toto te moanga, ko watumata te moana, no tamakima ko aho, ko landu toko whanau, ko Makala toko inoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Now, when we talk about Lovable, we all have a love story that connects us to place. And I love to share my pepe heart because I feel it so eloquently brings in that connection. And I think one of the reasons why is that we're all sitting here as professionals, but we're all people. And with us, we all carry amazing heritage and values that have turned us into who we are. And just like that's created who we are, our cities are also created and our built environments also created based on that heritage and those values. So I often think we need to actually look backwards, and I think the example Sean just gave of looking backwards as to how our cities are created in order to look forward is one way in order for us to create that resilience. Now, there's a lot of talk about livability, and I think sometimes we get focused on these metrics of what is livable, and we count trees and we count the amount of open space. But actually, yes, livability has brought some great things, but I kind of feel our cities or our public spaces, and certainly our built environment, we should get more than that. It shouldn't just be livable. I would expect my place to be livable. We don't live in a house, we love our home, and that's really the attitude in terms of how we can start to create cities and places. And that's really sort of, I guess, the spark of really pushing this shift in paradigm from going from livable to what I like to call lovable, which is focusing on what that affinity is to place. And when you start to think in that realm, all of a sudden you start to shift things. And what I think in regards to that, when we started to look into this concept, was how about we start to think of all infrastructure as being social infrastructure? Now, that's not really rocket science, and it's a pretty straightforward, because you would hope that all infrastructure is planned for the people that it's serving. After all, they are going to be the users. But actually what that means is that it's starting to think of infrastructure of it's not just a. So it's not just a train station, it's a place where people gather. It's a place of local commerce, it's a place of heritage often in terms of where cities are created, and it's also a destination. It's also, it's a key landmark. But if you think in this way, all of a sudden you can start to apply this concept to every form of infrastructure. So it's not just a dam, it's a recreation facility. It's a place of scenic beauty, of people coming to see it. Dams are also tied to our heritage, and also are immensely culturally significant because they are connected to water as well. And I say that because in terms of how we plan it, when you start to look at it in this way, all of a sudden you're starting to leverage the asset in terms of looking at its long-term economic viability, and all of a sudden you're starting to see these, it's not just one function, it's multiple functions, and there's huge social return and obviously economic return in terms of really starting to plan for that future thinking in terms of future, thinking forward. And in order to do that, lovable is really about how we understand that affinity to place. And so there's two concepts. One is place identity, and there was talk this morning about focusing on place-based infrastructure. Now, place identity is actually well encapsulated in my PPH, or in the PPH, and how you look at place. But it's also captured in terms of, what you think of when you think of your place. It's what makes our cities different. The whole thing of these metrics is not about to make cities the same. So it's why Auckland's different to Wellington. It's also why different suburbs also have different identities. And it comes down to those natural features, your social connections. It could also be that awesome pie shop that everyone goes to that you're kind of proud of, because there is that. But coupled with that is also the people experience. And I think with regards to Sean's work, Matt's work, that's where, it's really understanding what is that people experience. Who are those people moving through that place? What is the day in the life for the worker, the visitor, the resident? And take into account their demographic. Are they there for a long time? Are they passing through? Are they familiar or unfamiliar? I think understanding those different pathways is so important because we're all different. We experience the environment in different ways. For me as a female, there are many environments I walk through where I don't feel safe. So how do we look at, in terms of our planning, our infrastructure, and our built environment, it's really lovable, looks at place identity and people experience. And by doing that, we then can start to see the opportunities inherent. And I'm a social planner. I do a lot of social impact assessments on infrastructure. And whilst I'm often focusing on both the positive and then the potential adverse impacts, I think sometimes we're missing a beat because actually we need to be looking at what those opportunities are. And then, there's fantastic opportunities when you start to think in this all infrastructure is social infrastructure of going beyond. In that you can then add things like, is it a public square in a train station? Or, when we saw that example this morning in Mangere Bridge of adding the little fishing rods that people can actually fish, it becomes a recreation facility. So really, it's actually starting to look at, if we're planning for the long term, what are going to be the multiple different ways that people can use this asset? But also, and I think most importantly, if COVID's shown us anything, it's that we live in a time of change and things can change very quickly. So it's very hard, and I think sometimes we get caught up in looking at what was your daily trip or focusing on the short term. By starting to look at place identity and people experience, we're actually starting to look a little bit more longer term because we're focusing on the experience. And by focusing on the place, and there's been discussions about that today, by focusing on the place, you're actually starting to focus on what the potential in that place, and therefore it's more longitudinal in terms of what those benefits are going to be. And at the end of the day, people don't move for the sake of moving. It's actually the place that's going to guide that movement. So I guess I've covered a few concepts there, but I think, really, we are people. And I think really coming at it from that people perspective and embedding that in how we're planning is so important. But the other little gem I think I'll leave, I guess as a thought, is that some of that sounds really big and that you need to do lots, but actually I love the example of love is in the little things. It doesn't take a lot. Sometimes it's literally just that, a fishing rod on a bridge, or it is that, knitting on trees. It's those little things that actually create that delight per metre, and actually that's what contributes to creating that sense of place.
Fabulous. Thank you, Michaela. I think everybody in this room is probably in this sector, I'd imagine, because of their desire to have infrastructure deliver for people. So a great kind of extension of our concept of livable, and really does play to the heartstrings, I think. So I'm going to turn back to you, Matt, and just ask you about the challenges with creating a tool like the one you have. What was your journey in developing it, and how did, what sort of barriers were in the way of the development of that? So I'm interested in Frankly AI, and is Frankly male or female? I've got to ask that question. Or androgynous, perhaps?
So, we have a policy that no AI has gender. So, Frankly was thought up. She came out of my family. I used to say, some of you might still do this. I used to say, look, honestly, I think, my wife said to me, look, are you not honest the rest of the time? And so we decided that I should say, frankly. And so that's how Frankly's come about, is that people should be able to say, things that they want to say. I guess there are many barriers in a startup, I have to say. Probably the most interesting one is getting trust back with communities. And it varies on the community. I don't know if you've seen the graph of trust of government, sort of on the way down around the world. Maybe not in Wellington, but the rest of us, suffer that. And so when we go to people, particularly with an AI tool, and say, hey, we want to collect all your information. It's going to be really, really. You have to earn the trust, and the Western philosophy. It's almost I'll give you my information if I want to, and that's fine. But we did a lot of work. Obviously, Frankly speaks te reo Māori, and the language is a taonga, and so it's not really ours to take advantage of or make a benefit of. It's ours to help create benefits in the community. And so I think part of that process of sitting down with iwi, and obviously we have Māori on our team, and actually going through, what is it to share mātauranga? What is this? What is the concept? We need to fully understand these sorts of things, and so I think it's something that in infrastructure we haven't really dealt with. You might have seen my excited LinkedIn post where I basically said, we've talked about inclusivity, but we've taken it at a very simple level. Mm. So I think the barriers are around trust. We did some work with the Samoan community, and again, it was different. It was a lot more around the, and excuse if it's the wrong word, but the hierarchy in Samoan society, making sure that we were very respectful to the right people and more casual with others. So it's, that was probably the biggest challenge, I think. It wasn't technical. It was that sort of reconnecting with communities.
Great. And Sean, I have a somewhat similar question for you, because I would imagine that the city is changing daily. There is, I well remember from when I was working for a contractor and had the challenges of cable strikes and other utility strikes when utilities weren't quite where the as-built said they were. So how are you maintaining your tool and updating it? How do you go about doing that? So
the idea of digital twins covers a whole gamut of related technologies. At one end of the spectrum, you have what's called a product twin, which is something like a microwave. At the other, you have twins of cities and nations. They behave as digital markets. So what we have done is partnered to map all of Wellington's underground utilities across about 300,000 square metres of central corridor. And so that's used ground penetrating radar. It's gone into the asset databases of the utilities to locate them. And so what that process has done is essentially scanned the ground, located these things, scanned the trenches that have been opened to find them, and created an incredibly accurate database of what's down there. The really innovative part, however, has not been the technology, it has been the organisational response, which is how do we take this body and make it live? And to do that, ironically, you cut it up. And you start to give it back to the utilities to integrate into their asset data system so that the APIs or the internet string that joins them together can start to pipe that data back in real time. And so what you end up with is a form of organisational learning. And the secret sauce is actually to do with the legal innovation of how, as a road controlling authority and a corridor manager, do we use our regulatory power to make those systems digital and temporal. Now, for Wellington, the stakes are very high. We're investing about $7.8 billion in mass rapid transit last time I looked, and another $4.5 billion in water pipe upgrades, and then there's further billions that are going into things like greening streets and introducing water-sensitive urban design. And all of this is going to take place essentially over the next decade and has to be ready for the next century of growth. Our new district plan is quite an interesting one in that, unlike other councils introducing the NPSUD, or the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, we are doing it at the same time as creating a new district plan. That district plan increases the capacity of Wellington for housing by 435%. It is the biggest step change in our history. To provision that level of growth, you have to be able to generate efficiencies and certainties in order to balance the needs of those residents that we don't have yet versus the ones we do.
Very good. So you're optimising your digital twin lets you optimise your build program and align different utility providers, is what you mean, yeah?
Absolutely, and it's all about how do we achieve that purpose. For cities, purposes don't change, technologies do. So if we can hold firm on our purpose and stabilise our data streams, then we can shift from generation of technology, delivering value at each step.
Great. Sounds very, I think everybody needs one. It sounds like everybody needs one. So look, we heard a lot this morning about, what I like to call the washing machine of reform. And I'm just really interested in how you all think, and you can answer, you can choose who answers this question now, that washing machine of reform, how that's going to hit each of your worlds, and what impact it's going to have on you. So we've got a lot of change happening simultaneously, and what impact do you think that will have, or what impact do you think you will have on that? So happy for whoever to answer. That was a tricky one. Clearly you're all looking at each other.
I'll have a go.
You have a go, Sean.
So as well as working for the council, I also sit on the Open Government Partnership for the Public Service Commissioner. And one of the biggest bits of reform that most people in this room probably haven't read is the Public Service Act. I completely forgive you, it's not very interesting. But the piece of it that is interesting is it creates a universal geography for public services. So all of the police districts, the new health agencies, the water agencies, they all actually align at a certain level or can be aggregated. And a lead public service commissioner is put in place for each geography. So that means, for example, here in Auckland, there will be a public servant from one of those ministries whose job it is to convene all the others. That creates that infrastructure of collaboration that local government can then plug into. The challenge for us, though, particularly in my world, is we're creating digital estates for organisations that don't exist yet. I have to build this digital twin below the city, investing now, because we are going to be physically investing now, for an organisation that ultimately will be blasted out the side of my organisation and about 17 other organisations and glued back together again, which is quite challenging. It's all right. It's okay, somebody's got to report my words back to the boss.
I hate to tell you we're taping this, Sean.
In terms of the other reform areas, for local government, it's a unique position. The challenge for us is, again, understanding and holding firm to those purposes, because they will be there on the other side of the reform, and we mustn't allow what is ultimately the reshuffling of organisational functions to stymie progress on addressing the biodiversity emergency, addressing the climate emergency, making sure our people are housed, creating an economy that will sustain us into the future.
Right answer. Do either of you other two want to have a crack at that question, that very open question?
I'm happy to sort of, I guess, spring off what Sean was saying. I think, yes, there is a lot of reform happening and there's a lot of change happening. And I think all of us in the room, and we're all sitting here talking about climate change and what have you, and I think there is a broader recognition amongst the community of everyone recognising that something needs to change, and the love of the car will need to change, and this push in terms of looking at multimodal, in terms of, and we've heard a lot about that today. And I think there's huge opportunities, and I think the spatial plans is exciting in terms of looking at what does that mean for our cities and our places. And I think this is where, to some extent, we've gone through these different cycles, and whenever you look at planning, and there's always these cycles in terms of, okay, going to big centres and what have you, but also we're seeing the rise of the local, and I think COVID's helped us really appreciate that. And I think this is where, actually, yes, you've got this, there's the dichotomy of the cars versus the pedestrians versus the cyclists and what have you. The reality is all of us drive a car, all of us walk, all of us, depending on at what point in time. But I think within this whole rise of the local and this whole push of the neighbourhood is also the beauty of looking at, well, what does walking and cycling mean for our neighbourhoods, and getting that feel back. And I think there were some advantages of COVID actually showing us the importance of the local. And I think within the reforms, some of that realisation will come back. And that's not to say that, CBDs and things like that are going to suffer. I think there is that shift in the balance. But I think broadly, when I talk about place identity and people experience, is actually, what do our local towns mean to us? Because they are part of our identity. They are part of, why we've all chosen to live where we live because of it. And there's a sense of pride within that. And I think within that, there's that realisation of the things of the change is going to happen. And I think wrapped within that, there is this, how are we thinking 30 years into the future? And people are starting to wrap their heads around that, not for our sake, and that's been sort of spoken of today, but also, what's the next generation going to be like? And there is this move, and we're seeing the shift, and we're sort of at that cusp of it, that I think the reforms are timely in that there's also a huge shift in our own thinking with regards to how can we do things better, but also with that better comes all of these other advantages that connect in and bring the environment into the social, into the economic as well.
Yeah, I can just very briefly, our mission statement kind of, am I on? Sums up, no voice left behind. There's so much change happening. But I think what people don't understand is that a lot of these new agencies and things, they're built on new technical foundations. I often say to my people at Becca, I say, it's weird. I sit in here and it's almost like technology is stable. Then I go back to my desk and working in AI, it's like working in a hurricane. IBM is our business partner, and they send me emails every 2 weeks or so saying, hey, you can do this now. I'm like, oh my goodness, I never dreamt I could do that. So I just think we mustn't underestimate the fact that these organisations are going to be built on a technical foundation that is entirely different. It's going to be much more like what Sean's talking about than what we can even dream of, maybe.
Exciting
Yeah.
prospect that we can do all this other stuff. Right, well, I'm going to ask the audience now. I'm not seeing any questions come through. I'm looking at my moderators over there. We've got, and happy for anyone to submit questions via the app. I can't see any, Laura, weirdly. Let me just have a look. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, so we've got one here from Mayor. How do we share the data from digital twins, user insights and placemaking design? What are the enablers and barriers? Now, to some extent, we've probably already asked about the barriers, but how do we share the data and insights?
So, the sharing data is an interesting one. We've long had an open data mantra in our organisation, and we put out a lot more data than most local governments. But we have also found that we have to also share capability. And particularly in the gaming technology end of digital twins, it's very hard to get staff. So what that has meant is making space for our mana whenua to join our department and learn these techniques so that when they are skilled, they can take that back to their organisation and then build on that foundation of open data, tell their stories back to the council and equalise that democratic input. Ultimately, I've always viewed the most successful partnership as one where you can disagree but do so respectfully. And that capability building is something that we still don't always get right. We have quite an interesting system of reverse mentoring. So one of the great things about working for a big metropolitan council is we have enormously skilled senior professionals. And so what we've found is we can pair them with people younger in their careers or from different backgrounds, and actually the exchange goes both ways. You end up with more digitally literate decision makers and managers, and you end up with wiser leaders of today. And in that, we sort of need to remember what technology actually means. It's a Greek word. It ultimately translates roughly as craft. Crafts are not magic, they can be learned.
And I think building on, I guess, with regards to that question of, how do you measure, how do you share? And one of the challenges we all see, particularly in social, is it's quite intangible, or when I talk about social value, how are you capturing that? And that's something that certainly we've been looking into, because here I am saying, you can capitalise on your social benefit, right, and social value. So a lot of the stuff we've been looking at is how are you actually measuring the success of what you're implementing? And councils do amazing work. They really do. And the challenge that I've seen, and this is someone sitting outside of council, obviously, is how do you actually show that back in a tangible form of, metrics or measures or what have you. And so part of the thing is looking at, well, how do you demonstrate that, a sporting field is actually generating economic return? And it's not going to generate economic return because you're selling tickets to use the sporting field. It's generating that return in that you've got people exercising. You've got people out and about, and therefore they're healthier, they're happier. Some of that return is actually going to come back a bit more longitudinally and sometimes indirectly than that direct cause and effect. And I say that because, New Zealand's amazing in the sense that the Living Standards Framework is an amazing policy and an amazing document. But it's sitting behind that is a lot of, measures and metrics, and it's just looking at how do you measure the success and thinking a little bit more broadly of if you're putting in place something, how do you capture that? Now, sometimes that's going to be a direct cost-benefit piece, and that's awesome because that's easy. Sometimes it's looking a little bit closer of what's the actual indirect benefit, or is there a proxy that will relate to that? And I think it's sharing that data for how have you captured the implementation you've put in place, because I think there's a lot of learning with regards to how to do that. And we've, certainly within my Lovable framework, we've done a lot of work and looking at, okay, how can you measure in these considerations and so forth. But I think it's something that don't think just because it's social, it's intangible, it can become tangible. It's just trying to work out something that demonstrates how one thing relates to another, even if it's just an indirect cause. And I think that sharing of information, particularly when we're talking about social sustainability, is going to be critical of sharing results as well.
Right. Now, I've got another question specifically for you, Matt, on the extent to which people are going to trust, frankly, AI to do a better job than human interventions.
Yeah. And thanks to whoever asked that question.
It was Warner.
So there's always a human in the loop. I mean, that's I was talking about the 2-week thing. 2 weeks ago, we couldn't write a full report on what everyone said. Now we can. So we actually just connect Frankly up to another tool, and it will write a full report of what the 10,000 people believe about things in Auckland. That worries me a little bit that the human's kind of moving a little bit out of the loop. But it actually relates to the question you just asked before, and it's interesting because I live and dream live and dream, live and drink, whatever it is, AI. And we don't like sharing information. It's people's information, and we need to have people to trust us that it won't be used against them or used to sell them something or those sorts of things. So we have almost daily conversations on how we protect data, and when we do share it, how we do that in a very sensitive way. I think I've been in forums, global forums, and it's curious being a Kiwi when I hear people from the Northern Hemisphere talking about Te Māori and Maori data sovereignty. I think, well, that's weird that they're telling me about this stuff. And the reason they're doing it is that it's quite a unique philosophy around the world, that data is owned by a community for the benefit of that community. And so frankly, we've really taken that on. So yes, trust is everything, really. There are some people who will never trust AI, but AI is getting so good now that it's almost, I wouldn't say addictive, but...
is it sentient is the question, isn't it? Was that coverage recently? So I'm going to ask one more question. I think we've probably got time for one, maybe two more questions. A really great question from Kaya Freeman about the fact that sustainability initiatives can themselves sometimes be quite contentious, and how do we use, or can we use these tools that you're all talking about to build better understanding and awareness of the benefits of sustainability and the measures we might be taking. So how can we use them? You're using it to take information in, Matt. Can you also use it as a way of disseminating information, I think is what Kaya's asking. I can't see Kaya. She's somewhere out there. Is that your question, Kaya? Yeah, great. So.
Yeah, so we always say leave Frankly on forever. Why do you turn it off once you've built your project? Why don't you want to hear about people and what their experiences are of your pathway or your sewage treatment plant or those sorts of things? So I think we have the ability now to have that sort of ongoing conversation. One of the little tricks we use is people love to see their own comments, their own thoughts being used. And so while word clouds seem a little bit childish, a massive word cloud with all the themes that people have talked about, you'll look at it and you'll see, there I am. People are taking notice of me. So it's all about building that kind of diverse community, I guess, of views and feeling part of that.
That's great. I'm going to sneak one last question in because the time is counting down. And my question is actually to you is, and that's just moved on me, which is annoying. How will the digital twin be able to predict and curtail or avoid future critical infrastructure failures? So is it predictive?
Well, in terms of critical infrastructure failures, we have a city that's uniquely suited to training it. Silver lining. So we were very fortunate. We won one of the Bloomberg Global Innovation Prizes that's supplied $1 million to the city for using digital twins for climate adaptation. And that's one of the focuses of that. In our district plan, we have just been using it to apply enormously complex science to essentially freeze development on our coastlines. So you'll no longer be able to build new houses along Wellington's coast. The ability to explain to local communities and show them what it looks like has been critical to getting that regulation across the line and before the commissioners. I grew up in South Auckland, the bit where you drive down the motorway and eventually cages appear on the motorway bridges. I remember what it was like hearing a newsreader who sounded like me and not like a knockoff British person. That was incredibly powerful, and when you stand in your own space in virtual reality and understand the science applied in a way you can see it happening, there is a power in that suddenly means it's not an abstract problem anymore.
I love that answer, and I think that is the perfect end, seeing ourselves in our infrastructure. And what more powerful metaphor could we have than that? So thank you very much to all of our panellists, and thank you to the audience for their great questions.